So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. As you all know, my name is Amanda, and I'm the co-lead of CDLI, the Community Development Learning Initiative, which is a network for community-minded people seeking to deepen their connections and capacities to create positive change in their communities. And I have the pleasure of co-hosting this conversation today with the incredible Twyla Moon.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Twyla Moon. I'm a community social worker with the City of Calgary. As a community social worker, we work in geographical communities to work towards increasing the capacity, inclusivity, and economic participation of marginalized residents in communities. And we assess social issues and work with residents to come up with neighborhood-based solutions. And so I'm really excited to be co-hosting along with Amanda because it's based on a conversation that we had a couple months ago at one of the practitioner gatherings. I had approached Amanda to talk with her about if she knew of any resources or tools around leaving or transitioning out of communities. I'm in a neighborhood where there's been some kind of demographic changes in the neighborhood, and we're really kind of exploring or looking at, is it a good time to look at assessing leaving the neighborhood? And there wasn't a lot of resources that we could kind of track down, and it led to this conversation of us perhaps, having a little bit of a conversation at the summit today to pick the brains and get some information from all of our diverse practitioners in this session, because we realize it's perhaps an area that as community development practitioners, we might not examine or explore as much as that kind of entry or assessment process. And it's something that at Calgary Neighborhoods, our team is trying to develop to kind of guide and support our work. As we wrote in the description for today's conversation, sometimes as organizations, we're faced with the question of when it's time to leave community, and often that's emerging from questions around resource allocation. The when to leave is promptly followed by the questions of like, how do we know a community is ready? What might that exit and transition look like? And so we're really hoping to explore this together today and learn from each other's experiences. So it'll be quite a bit of a conversation with the hopes that we can kind of generate something useful for community development practitioners to enhance their efforts moving forward. And so we'd love to start by getting a feel for the experience in the room with us today. So if you want to just raise your hand to let us know if you've been involved in an organization or agency that has transitioned out of a community before.
And if your camera off, maybe you can do a reaction or something to give an indication if you've been involved in that. Thanks, Ruth. Awesome. And Lindsay, I see you've said yes in the chat as well. So it sounds like a couple of people have. Interesting. So what we would love to do to get us started is to kind of start by surfacing some key factors and tools that you can draw on your own experiences with, or if you don't have experience with transitioning out of a community yet, things you might anticipate if you did. So we've got some Google Slides that Twyla threw in the chat earlier. You can throw your thoughts there, or you can throw them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share them here, however you prefer. But we'd love to know, what do you think are key factors to consider when practitioners are exiting a community? So again, that question is, what do you think are key factors to consider when practitioners are exiting a community? Sustainability and resident capacity building. Yeah, thanks, Daniela. And if anybody says something where you're like, yeah, I agree with that, if you want to like write a +1 or add that there, that will help give us a sense of how strong of an issue or factor that might be. Any other thoughts on key factors to consider when practitioners are starting to think about leaving a community? And feel free to unmute yourself and share too. I see on this Google Slides, we've got resources that are available to use kind of post that departure. So are there still those resources there? Another sustainability of community initiatives. Laura HSC, how to exit well with community, part of the decision and knowing what can fill the gap. Yeah. Resident capacity building showed up on the Google slide as well. Interesting, Yvonne says in the chat, resistance to initiatives, positive change, not working together, remaining in silos. So if you're finding a lot of roadblocks or that lack of cooperation there. As you can continue to brainstorm or think about what those key factors to consider when leaving, we'd also love to know what kind of tools or processes can be helpful in making that decision. I think some of you are starting to get at that, like a tailored support system as we exit community that showed up on the board is a great segue into that as well. So any other thoughts on those key factors or tools or processes that you've used or that you think would be helpful or important when thinking about exiting a community?
And Ruth, you're correct. Sometimes we don't have control, and it's funding that kind of can dictate those decisions of whether or not we remain in a neighborhood or not. So sometimes it's kind of out of our realm of influence for sure.
So there's obviously a lot of different factors, and it's going to be a little bit dependent on how we are working in that community in the first place, and what our role as a practitioner is. So we'd love for you to keep thinking and adding it either to the chat or the slides. And we also have a form that we've created that we've shared the link to. So if you have sparks or ideas that come up over the next couple of weeks and you want to throw that there, that would be really helpful, because we're really hoping that this conversation moves beyond just what we're doing today and can be something that we're kind of like working on and developing as a community good over time. But I think we would love to really focus our conversation today on transitioning. So I think Twyla is going to set us up for the real meat of our conversation today.
Yeah, we kind of want to, sometimes transitions happen fast and they, like we said, can be out of our control. We can change positions, funding, and we may not have exited a community in a way that felt good or supported. But if we really want to kind of focus, if like we had the time to really carve out this process, to be thoughtful about it, to set the community up for success, what would we want that process to kind of look and feel like? And so we want to focus the conversation on exploring like what a good transition process might look like and what makes it maybe difficult. So some of the things we want to consider is maybe some of those strategies or tools or metrics to look out, capacities, that kind of thing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a bit of a circle process so that we kind of give a chance for everybody to speak. And we know that not everybody has, definitely that perhaps we probably have all been through transitions in life, whether that's in a neighborhood or in our personal lives. And so I think some of that can kind of lend itself to thinking about the transitions in neighborhoods as well. So what we are going to do is we're going to be hopefully, our question is how do we transition a way that supports the neighborhood or community, but helps practitioners exit in a good way. And so we want to draw on your experience. And so given that we have about 14 people, we'll have about 1 to 2 minutes to speak on this question. So feel free, if you have additional thoughts, to kind of add them in the Zoom chat or Google Slides. And we're going to kind of just name people to speak based on how you show up on screen. But is there anybody who's really interested and keen to kind of get us started, who'd like to speak?
I can start off. So I don't have too much experience in leaving the communities or whatever with the social work aspect, but I think that a good way to leave a community is always, like any transition, is always to make sure that the people who are part of the community are knowing that you're about to leave and like have the opportunity to ask you those questions that they might need and get the support and resources before you leave, so that they don't feel like they had it one day and then the next day was gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that communication piece, right, is really critical of like, how do we inform partners? How do we inform residents, right? Because we do invest and cultivate, these beautiful relationships with community. We cultivate great relationships with partners as well, and even businesses and other kind of stakeholders in the community. And so it is really important to kind of help communicate what the next steps look like. So yeah. Any other?
I just wanted to add, sorry. I just wanted to add on what Aspen was saying about living a community and communication. Also, like considering how long, giving time for the residents to prepare. If there are things that you need to put in place, have people be in place of certain programs that are being run, just to make sure that when you leave, like things will continue. Things that we're running will still continue running.
Yeah, sometimes we have to kind of be a little bit more proactive in our thinking. Sometimes, you know, if we I mean, ideally, it would be great if we had a longer period of time to be able to work towards that transition. Sometimes that doesn't always happen, but if in our ideal situation, giving that time and ability for people to kind of process that change is really essential for sure. I'm going to call on people that I just know. So I'm going to call on Lindsay.
Hi, Twyla, and hi, everybody. Yeah, I was just going to say I'm currently in a community that has had a lot of turnover in the last couple of years, just with maternity leaves and new positions. And I do get comments a lot from residents saying like, oh, I thought it was this person or that person. And you can sense that, you know, the transition maybe didn't go great, and it's a little bit frustrating for them. So I think it's always, and I understand things happen and people have to leave for whatever reasons, but you know, whenever we're able to, I think it's really important to include volunteers or people who have showed up quite consistently in different community events, just to have them be a part of that, and hopefully even be able to introduce them to the new worker if there's somebody coming in the community to help make that connection. I unfortunately didn't really get to piggyback off anybody when I went to my community, and it's just been challenging to meet some of those connections who have probably been really connected in the past. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Lindsay. Yeah, I mean, those are good examples of what we want to try. You know, even learning from when exits went bad or not as smoothly is really important learning, I think, on how we can phrase it. And you're right, having those kind of community leaders are really essential in kind of making those transitions, right, or supporting that as well, whether it's a new member coming in or setting those leaders up for success if there's no other kind of support coming into the neighborhood.
So Trish had raised her hand earlier. Trish, are you wanting to jump in?
Yeah, when you're leaving a community, it's about connecting people that you are working with to either other people like peers or other services. Just making sure there isn't that abrupt cutoff and they're left hanging.
Yeah, really good point. I know that we've had a lot of folks in our neighborhood that have been leaving and going to new neighborhoods, and it's, you know, it can be a little bit you know, overwhelming for folks, right? As they try, you know, to not have that access and that support, a sense of support in a neighborhood. So you're definitely right in access, you know, helping connect them with those resources.
I see in the chat. Oh, sorry, is that what you were going to say?
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I see in the chat, Yvonne, you've shared, I see the community practitioner's role is to facilitate or work alongside community and not be the doers, to encourage community-driven, provide the support and guidance. Communities move at a pace that is comfortable for them. Trust the process. So yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Yvonne? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
You think after 2.5 years we'd figure that out. It'd be interesting because my role as the Alberta Healthy Communities Initiative, I'm a health promotion facilitator, and it's always interesting on what we term as community readiness versus what the community terms as community readiness. So I would be interested in hearing more about that, because it's more than just beyond assessments or a checklist.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important distinction to make. And so often within institutions, we can kind of say, well, like, we need all of these justifications or reasons to explain it away, but that's not actually rooted in community. And I know when Twyla and I were first having this conversation, I was like, it's interesting because depending on what approach to community development you take, like, this shouldn't even have to be a question, because if you're kind of really employing asset-based community development, for instance, that's all about being citizen-led and like citizen power and that sort of thing. And so whether there's a practitioner there doesn't matter so much. Maybe it's just to kind of get things started, or like say, like, here's a space you can use. But it really is kind of grounded in like, what are the values and principles that are driving your community development efforts, and whose voice are we centering? Because such an important distinction of like, how does the agency or institution view readiness, and how does the community view readiness? And like, sometimes, like, what are the barriers that we are putting in place that's preventing community activity from happening, that might actually allow for more to happen if we're not there saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, because that doesn't fall within our purview or whatever. So that's sort of like some of my thoughts or sharings that first came up in this conversation, and appreciated jumping off your thought, Yvonne.
Yeah, and just to add to that, yeah, definitely those barriers. You know, one of the barriers that we've seen in some of our neighborhoods is access to space. We have very capable, you know, residents that are able to do, you know, resident-led initiatives without our support, but because maybe a lack of trust on housing providers' part, they're not able to access those community spaces to do events and bring people together. And it was really preventing people from kind of mobilizing and doing more within the neighborhood as well. So definitely those barriers are real, and something kind of to work towards in order to support residents to kind of be those leads in the neighborhood. Thanks for sharing, Yvonne. Michelle, would you like to go next?
Sure, I can go, thank you. I think in like my experiences with maybe even just like staff turnovers and those kinds of changes, just creating as much consistency as possible for like volunteers or community members or residents, and just making sure that whoever or whatever is replacing the person leaving has like the tools and the knowledge in place to continue on the work that's been done with like as little bumps in the road as possible.
Yeah, setting up staff, you know, providing those tools and resources, and the same with residents, right? If they're requiring certain training or information around different resources to support their work, then we want to ensure that that's in place before, you know, before leaving a neighborhood. I'm going to go to Tess. Would you like to speak?
Tess just joined, so might not know the question
Okay.
yet.
Sorry, Tess. I'll go to Laura.
Sure. I have, I guess, more of a question, which is, when you like enter a community, do you enter with an end game already mapped out in terms of what needs to have happened in order for you to leave? Because I almost wonder if you have that then, and the funders know about that, then they're on that journey with you to that end transition point.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. I don't think sometimes, I'm not sure about everybody, but I don't think our program typically has that in mind. I think we're trying to get to that place of really thinking about it, because our work is very much resident focused. It's hard to know where that kind of will lead to sometimes, right? And sometimes it can take more time than others, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts to that question.
Or possibly it is about that sustainability and where and who, in order to complete that exit, who and where does the project, the initiative, or embedding the way you're working, like if we're using ABCD, the asset-based community development, who can we train or adopt, embed that way of working, and as we exit out and continue with that support and guidance, maybe from whether it, now that we use Zoom or online support and not necessarily being physically in the community.
Yeah, that's such an important piece. And I know in thinking about some of the key factors that came up, like that hits on like resident capacity and that sustainability piece of really thinking about like what are those skill sets, but also just like practice and experience. I don't know if anybody else can relate to this, but I find so often we encounter people who have all the skills and all the abilities. It's just that confidence piece where they're not quite ready to do it on their own. And so giving people the chance to actually do it, to actually host the meeting on their own and kind of realize, oh, I can do this. Like I totally have this. That makes it easier. And so like, yeah, what are the conditions we need to create to allow for those people who do have those abilities in community to continue carrying that on?
I was going to just add, I liked Laura's question there about, do you go in with an end date in mind? And I think depending if it's a long way off or not, but kind of having it as like a mindset of how can I eventually leave the community? So how can I be working to build that capacity and provide those opportunities while I'm here, but knowing I won't always be here, like as a mindset, whether you're there for a year or 6 months or 5 years. I think that's a helpful kind of frame of mind to keep present of how eventually when I leave, will I be leaving things.
Thanks, Lori. Ruth, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. I'd like to sort of tag on to what was just said. Like my position is long-term with AHS, but as a community development coordinator, my focus is not as, it's partly to do with the initiatives that the community wants to do by listening, lots of the 100 cups of coffee idea, and hearing from them. I see over the years waves of excitement and ability and capacity to take on projects, and then other times where that capacity decreases and really responding to the community at the time. But while we do that, we are also developing in community development, developing leaders and developing the skills within the community to do certain things, not necessarily in a leadership role, but in different ways. So what I try to do is in all of my work, make it everything that I do, I let the community know what has been done, give them lots of documents. Let's say I've ordered sunscreen or whatever that project is, helping them, because right now, post-COVID, it seems like the communities I'm involved with are overwhelmed and unable to do, so that I step in and do, but share everything, all the details, the companies I've gone to, how much the cost was, how I connected with them, all those details that should I not be around someday, they have that. But even more importantly, as I see skills developed within the individuals in the community, that to me is a real success, even more than the initiatives that they've accomplished. And hopefully from that sustainability if I'm not around.
Thanks for sharing, Ruth. Yeah, I think that's an important piece of recognizing that there can be those waves in capacity in neighborhoods. We, especially when we are working with a lot of folks who are marginalized, that have those various stressors in their life. It can be, we do have those waves of people being able to participate in community and then having to step away too. So, we find that it's a constant cycle of engaging and going through that kind of circle of our community development approach. And so, or that theory of change. So definitely recognize that. But yeah, involving them and bringing people into that process of the planning and all those kind of logistical pieces is really important too, just to help people feel confident and skilled around how to, do those projects and the different aspects of them. Sayonara, would you like to go next?
Honestly, I'm just here listening all those ideas and taking notes what I should be doing about my own community. So I think I will leave this way for now. And yeah, maybe I will come up with like a question or a comment later. But now my brain is just like very busy. Digesting everything that I've been listening. Thank you.
No problem. And feel free to, if something comes to mind and you want to add it to the chat or to the forms sheet, feel free to do that too. I'll go to Richard.
Hello. I think, oh, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I don't have too much experience working directly with, okay, I'll talk about the experience I do have, I guess. I previously worked with the Students' Union, which is responsible for a body of, well, 9,000 undergraduate students. And it's inherently very high turnover because pretty much 80% of our student representatives don't continue past 1 year. And one huge challenge I came across was around institutional continuity. There's so many initiatives that start 1 year, but take multiple years to execute on. And unless that information is passed on to the next person, it sort of just gets halfway started and then never completed. And sort of echoing what people have said already, it's like, I found it really important to document information so that even if I'm not physically there, there's still a physical manual people can refer to and see what has worked, what hasn't worked. Otherwise, mistakes just repeat because people are starting from scratch each time. So I guess that's all I have to share. I'm similar to Sayonara, I'm also just sort of observing and being engaged with the conversation.
Awesome, thanks. So I can definitely relate to that experience, Richard. Live as a resident of the downtown core and trying to kind of build community here in a community that is constantly changing and people rarely live here for longer than a year. And so like that institutional continuity for like multi-year projects, absolutely, but sometimes even shorter term things where in less than a year, we've already had like half of our board leave the community itself, and that's the engaged people, So how do we keep things going, and how do we also like recognize that our communities are also not static? And so some of the people that we've been working with and who we've been seeing that skills development and super excited me, like, yes, like these are the people embedded who I know will keep doing things, and then they move as well, or their life circumstances change. And so that I think is another kind of layer of complexity that we're kind of having to face, and part of I think the struggle sometimes of like, how do we continue to do this, and how do we continue to support initiatives that are reflective of the people who make up that community in that moment. And that might be, so like, what does it mean to do this and be adaptable and flexible to people saying like, you know what, like we were really into this year, but now that we've got a few new people involved, this is where we want to put our energies. Or the people who've been spearheading a lot of the arts initiatives, for instance, are no longer able to do that. And so we're constantly having to pivot. So what does it mean to do all this work to like build that? Like, is there ever actually an end point, or is it constantly changing and evolving? And then what does that mean when we are being faced with the task of like, we have to leave this community because we have had a funding cut or whatever that may be, or like we're having a baby or whatever that is. So like, how do we navigate the fact that there is constant turnover, not only on our end as practitioners, but also in terms of the community?
I guess what are others' thoughts on that, around that constant transition? Do people see that in the work that they do, that continual turnover, or do you see folks coming and staying for a long period of time and you're able to continue to develop those capacities and skills of those residents? And what are your thoughts about, that constant turnover, and how do we still get communities to a place where they can do this work on their own when we are in that environment? Yes, Daniela.
So I think in the work that I do in particular, and I work with the Community Hubs Initiative in United Way, there's the question of this constant turnover, which is very much a reality in the work that we do. And we work with hub site leads and community social workers, and there's lots of turnover in those roles, as well as other really important supporting roles. So there's the question of when individuals who have created really important ties and relationships with residents are leaving community for many of the reasons that have been brought up. But then there's also the question of, as an initiative and as a network of support and as a funder, when do we exit community, right? So there's the one that happens more often, which is, this turnover. And I think it comes down to, it's very context driven and situational, but it also comes down to just empowering residents and community to believe that they are more than capable of doing it on their own. And a lot of what we do is involved around community initiatives being resident-led and capacity building for residents. And so that constant just belief in them and trying to get community to believe that they can achieve the goals that they want to, I think is really important. But then also understanding that, just because someone is going on maternity leave or someone is going to another organization doesn't mean that they're gone forever. And this sector is so connected, right? And so there's always opportunities to connect. And then also highlighting the fact that, a different perspective or a new point of view could actually be really beneficial. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we see transitions as bad and scary, but they can actually, invoke new ideas, new initiatives. And I know I've seen that in previous neighborhoods where I am one of those people who've left on mat leave, 2 of them, and seen folks come through and seen the unique, different work that people are able to kind of do in community just because of the different passions, interests, or connections they're able to make in those neighborhoods that perhaps were different from my own. So definitely that can be a huge benefit to community for sure.
And when I think about what does it mean to empower people, I kind of, a few of the comments that have come up earlier in the conversation are really percolating for me is that part of why we do the work we do is because we have access to resources, whether that's financial or time or physical space. And it's that is our greatest value. And so I think that that's a really important piece to think about, is that skills development, confidence building are absolutely part of the conversation, but a big part of it is we have access to really important pieces of the puzzle that if we're getting paid 30, 40 hours a week to hold space for those things and to be able to do that. But now we're kind of transitioning that to community members who aren't being compensated for that, for instance. So this is now on top of everything else. That's a real consideration that has to be factored in. And we, through our respective institutions, typically have access to insurance that allows us to host those events or to access spaces that others don't. So I think that these more structural pieces are important for us to think about and name. And perhaps this is where there needs to be some advocacy kind of within different systems as well. It's how do we transfer that? I know when COVID-19 was first hitting, there was some huge changes to the ways in which resources were distributed out of necessity. So for instance, for many years for food supports, it was like, well, we can only give you actual food, or we can only give you food, like resources in this way. And then suddenly funders were like, well, actually, I guess we can give you a gift card to a grocery store and trust you to purchase your own food. And so I wonder if part of that, part of the transition thinking is also about like, what are the barriers that our institutions put in place that require us to exist in the first place? And if we could just like transfer that like ability to use space, ability to access funds, to buy the food, to put on the event in a way where like we don't have to use an institution credit card or do the grocery shopping for them, like that, all of those pieces are going to make it so much easier for the community members who have the time and capacities to show up to actually show up. And that's like one of the biggest gaps that does kind of exist is that time piece, is the ability to like purchase things and that sort of thing. So I'm curious if people have thoughts or experience with that part of the transition and how that might get factored in.
I can speak a little bit about one of the transitions that kind of occurred in one of the neighborhoods I worked with. There was a wonderful organization. We were kind of working alongside each other, and they were able to get a space and actually develop it into a hub. And so we had kind of this overextension of perhaps resources in the neighborhood, and it was quite geographically small. And so we did end up allowing, we did kind of transition, but perhaps act as like a little bit of a point of contact as a city. So that way there was still that support that was there. But one of the other things that we remained in the neighborhood was our neighborhood grant program, which is a grant, a micro grant for residents that allows them to do kind of community-based projects around increasing social inclusion, community economic development, as well as truth and reconciliation. And so it allows residents to actually have those funds in order to do community initiatives. And so I know that not every organization has that ability, but it's an example of one way that we still were able to provide funding for residents to still continue to do that work. And they're supported by another organization in that community as well. So that's an example of some of the unique way we've transitioned out of plans, or act as almost like a contracted position in those neighborhoods. We might not be fully embedded, but we're still acting as a support. Is there anybody else around the room that has kind of held that type of role in other neighborhoods?
I apologize. My computer died, so I had to jump in on my phone. And so I'm not sure what the question is.
We were just talking, Lindsay, about like when maybe like what kind of if people have had a kind of experience around kind of providing more of those structural, like helping to advocate or change some of those structural pieces that might be kind of creating barriers for people in the neighborhood to allow them to still kind of continue that work. And then I was just speaking to my own experience around kind of being a little bit of a contracted position in one of my neighborhoods and still providing kind of grant funds and that kind of thing too.
So I see that Laura's added a great comment in the chat building off of this. So Laura says, I think knowing and mapping the key things that will need to be transitioned, but also the skills, confidence, training needed to own these things are great to recognize and then cultivate early through shared ownership, skills development opportunities, etc. Which is like such a great point to kind of thinking through, like as we do the work in our documenting the work, like what are all the things, what are all the factors, and how can we start to flag what those look like?
I can maybe build on that a little bit more, just because I'm thinking of it in terms of we're developing some training at the moment to enable a group of volunteers to give referrals to community organizations. And part of that, we need to have like the detailed things of what they need to do. And then the skills that will enable them to do that, and then how we actually develop those skills, and like what time frame we need to do that on in order for them to be ready by the time we need to launch that project. So then it becomes like really breaking it down into quite small things, and then knowing like, what does success look like? Like, how do we know that they have the skills to give good referrals?
With just a few minutes left, I'd love to pick up on that last piece you just said, Laura. And I know, Ruth, you had also brought this up, but what does success look like? We'd be curious if people want to throw in the chat or unmute themselves quickly of like, what does a successful transition out of community as a practitioner look like?
I think success, it looks like a community that believes in themselves, that they have the skills and abilities, and they know their community and are able to respond to what the community needs without the community development person needing to be there, so that they, through the whole process of doing community development, it's centered on the community, what they need, their assets, their barriers, and their ability to respond to that.
And to build on what Ruth was saying, it is also about a community or organization about really understanding and maintaining and continuing to collaborate to identify trends and opportunities, and be able to work together and not have those silos. And also respecting those individuals who sit at the table.
Great point so far. Any other thoughts on what success looks like? With our last 2 minutes then, I would love to hear your key learnings or takeaways from this conversation. You know, for me, I think one of my key takeaways is to develop that systems map and kind of think through those different pieces and plot it out, even knowing it'll probably change and evolve, but kind of just thinking through those different variables is a takeaway for me.
A takeaway for me is that this is a common concern, and that many communities and community development coordinators face that concern, so that I'm not alone in it. So this has been really affirming for me.
I agree with what Ruth just said there. It's very validating to know that like we're not the only ones having this like same challenge and difficulty.
And I think too, like not the only ones, but also knowing that this isn't a straightforward kind of answer. It's got a lot of moving parts and a lot of complexity to it. So that kind of confirms some thinking already on it. That's the case.
For me, was the reflection on how to exit well and being aware of the whole community when doing this. I love that. Thank you.
I think for me, it's like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Like understanding what you can control, and then the human factors or the funding factors you can't control, but then making sure you've got a plan in place around those controllable pieces.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think, you know, understanding our role in that residents and, you know, any community members oftentimes do look up to people who are leading things in their community and getting them involved. So just fostering that relationship, and just, you know, if there are going to be changes, just the importance of trying to keep everybody in the loop.
And for me, it, you know, definitely that kind of the thoughtfulness of really, when we enter community, being a little bit, even though, you know, our time in community varies and looks different each time we go into a neighborhood, is really being thoughtful about what we want to achieve with neighbors, to involve them in the plan and the process, to involve them in and kind of having that end goal in mind together with residents too, and to really look at those barriers that are really preventing communities from moving forward without the need for practitioners as well. And Daniela, thank you. Consolee, she shared my takeaway is that the process of leaving a community is complex. There's so many things that need to be considered for sure. And Daniela, her takeaway is the importance of both entering, being in and exiting community is strength-based with that CD perspective and approach. Anybody else would like to share before we wrap up? Well, me and Amanda would just like to thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And if you have any other thoughts, please feel free to go in and add to the forums as well. We're really excited to have this conversation. I think it's been really valuable, I think, for ourselves, and I hope for you as well. And like Ruth and Michelle said, it's affirming that we're not in this alone, and hopefully some of this learning can kind of be at least put together and provide some things to think of. And like Yvonne said, it's not like an asset, you know, it's not an assessment that you might have to do if they have all these check boxes. It does look gray, but perhaps there's a little bit of a roadmap of things to consider and look at as we're looking at entering and exiting a neighborhood. So with that, thank you very much. And we really hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.